I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Christy Zigler. And Christy is an assistant professor in population health sciences at Duke University in North Carolina, USA. Christy Zigler is a psychometrician, always have these long words, psychometrician, and statistician by training. And her primary interest is in designing tools for children with rare diseases so that their voices and the voices of their families can be prioritized in research, which I think you'll all agree is really, really important. Dr. Zigler was part of the team that developed the Observer-Reported Communication Ability, or ORCA measure, which we'll learn a bit about, through a partnership with the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics, or FAST, which is another rare neurodevelopmental disorder. The ORCA measure was designed for use in clinical trials to capture caregiver perceptions of communication ability for individuals with Angelman syndrome. Dr. Zigler is currently working on methods to scale up the ORCA measurement model and gather sufficient validity evidence for its use in other neurodevelopmental disorders with similar communication impacts, like Schinzel-Giedion syndrome. So we're really excited that through our collaboration with Combined Brain, and I see Terry Jo Bichelle, who'll be talking on Sunday on the meeting today, that we've had the opportunity to take part in the expanded ORCA study. And I'm going to hand over to Christy to tell us more about that. Thank you so much, Christy, for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I also have gotten the dreaded message that my internet is unstable. So if I start to cut out, please let me know, and I can always call in with my phone to keep going. So I'm really, really excited and grateful to be here today to talk about the work that we're doing in the Center for Health Measurement at Duke University, and talk about our collaborations with your community, as well as the ORCA measure. So ORCA stands for Observer Reported Communication Ability Measure. And so basically it's a survey that's designed to be given to caregivers of individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. And it gives us information about their communication ability. And it was specifically designed for clinical trials. And so today, in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking a little bit about clinical outcome assessments, which is another word for typically a survey, and why those are important for clinical trials, and sort of why, as a group, that is our research focus on improving and validating and evaluating these clinical outcome assessments. Then I'm going to tell the story of the original ORCA measure, so why we designed it, how we designed it, which talks a little bit about the methods that we use to ensure that we are developing meaningful and high quality survey instruments. And then finally, I think most exciting, I'm going to be talking about the current project and the collaboration that we have with the SGS Foundation, and how we are intending to serve your community. So before I jump in, some disclosures. So it's important to note that the study team, Duke University, has developed the ORCA measure, and if it's commercially successful in the future, we may benefit financially. I'm going to be talking about that new project today that's funded by the US Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And there's some information about that grant award that is here on this slide. And I'm happy to talk about any of these things in more detail if you have any questions for me or our team. And finally, it's important to note that the views expressed in this presentation are mine and not necessarily representing those of our funders or my employer. All right. So why are outcome measures so important for clinical trials? And so I'm going to use a lot of the terminology that we use here in the United States. So it comes from the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. So clinical trials, as I'm sure you all know, have really high stakes decisions attached to them, right? Like, do we want to give our children these medications? Is it going to make their life better? Is it going to improve the way that they experience their life? And so we focus on this idea of patient-focused drug development. And so typically we have a medication in question. We have some knowledge of safety and tolerability, but we want to know if it works. So in the clinical trial development pipeline, typically when we're at that stage, we take this medication, we give it to a group of people, and then we evaluate treatment benefit. And so the FDA is very explicit in the way that they define treatment benefit. So is the drug working? And that's related to how somebody is feeling, how they're functioning, and how they're surviving, right? And so if we're interested in how somebody is feeling or how they're functioning in their life, the main person or stakeholder that we usually ask is either that person themselves or their caregiver, right? Their parent. And the way that we actually get information about how somebody is feeling and functioning is that we usually give them a survey. We ask them a standard set of questions that gives us meaningful and important information about how that drug may be providing benefit or not. So since we're making these really important decisions about medications, we want to make sure that any clinical outcome assessment or survey tool that we're using is really high quality. And so there's a number of things that we look for in supporting the use of a specific clinical outcome assessment. And so the first thing is really we want it to be meaningful. So we want to make sure that whatever we're focusing on, whatever we're targeting with those medications is that it's meaningful to parents and stakeholders and families. And the danger there is we might, if we're not ensuring meaningful outcomes, we might end up with drugs that do something, but that something is not what families really place the highest priority on. The other thing that we're looking for with our clinical outcome assessments is that they're valid. So this at its minimum means that we're measuring what we say we're measuring, right? So if we say we're measuring communication ability, we want to make sure that we actually are measuring communication ability. We also want to make sure that any outcome measure we're using is reliable. So this means we're getting consistent, stable, trustworthy information. And then finally, we want to make sure that it's sensitive. So if there are changes happening, whether those are positive or negative, we want to make sure that we're going to be able to pick up on those within the responses on the clinical outcome assessment. So that's what our group does. We develop and we evaluate clinical outcome assessments or surveys to make sure that they are meaningful, they're valid, they're reliable, and they're sensitive. So how does our team really do that? And that's bringing me to the development of the ORCA measure and sort of where the story begins. So I'm going to come back to this slide a couple times during this talk to show you kind of the roadmap for how the ORCA project really develops. And so it really started with the Center for Health Measurement and the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. And in particular, FAST was looking ahead to really exciting clinical trials for their community, for their children. And we're recognizing the need to have these really high quality outcome assessments that they could use within clinical trials. And so they came to the Center for Health Measurement at Duke University, which I'm a part of, and had this specific mandate. We want a measure of communication ability for clinical trials. And we want it to be parent-centered. So we want to make sure we're focusing on the components of communication that are most meaningful to the families. And so what we did is we followed this roadmap, which is based off of established best practices and guidances to first identify the need for a new measure. Was there one out there that we could already use? And then once we identified that there was a need for a caregiver specific measure, how do we develop it? And so you can see here all of these different sort of icons that represent different steps in the process. So I'm going to go over just briefly kind of the major components of the development process. So that first one, which is titled Concept Elicitation, is really the formative qualitative work. So what we do is we sit down with stakeholders, in this case, caregivers and parents of individuals with Angelman syndrome, and we ask them, how do you communicate with your child? What do you notice? What is important? What is meaningful? What might help? Like, what are your wishes and hopes for your child in regards to communication? Once we had all that rich qualitative information, we built a conceptual framework. So basically, we defined communication ability using what we heard from parents. We use that to write the survey, ask the questions, what questions should we be asking? How should we be asking them? What instructions should we provide? Then once we had that survey, we went ahead and we piloted it. So we sat down with parents again and we had them work through it. And we asked them things like, do you understand what we're asking you? Are we giving you the right answer choices? Is your experience really captured within this measure? Usually we go through a couple of rounds of modification. And then once we had a more final version, we went through a translatability review. So we looked ahead. If we wanted to translate this measure into other languages, would we run into any issues? And then we gave that version of the survey to a larger group of caregivers, and we used our statistical methods to look at aspects of reliability and validity. And so the result of that formative study was this first version of the ORCA measure. And while we were doing that process, we had a lot of interest from both within the Angelman syndrome community, but also outside of that community, where there is a need to really understand and understand how to measure communication ability within other neurodevelopmental disorders that have sort of an atypical communication development pathway, so that we are really accounting for all of the types of communication that children are using. So I'm going to show just a few of the results from that original study to help show you all what actual content is on the ORCA measure and what it kind of looks like. And so this beautiful figure is one of the first drafts of our conceptual framework. So this is based off of the interviews that we did with parents. And what was not surprising for any of the parents, but I think was really well represented by this figure, is that there was a lot of communication happening within the families. There were a lot of things that parents noticed, that they emphasized, that they valued with their children. And so there was a lot of content that we could translate into a measure. And one of the things that was surprising is that a lot of these communication behaviors might be missed on some of the existing tools. And a lot of that had to do with the ways that children were communicating, and adults too. So modality just means how somebody is communicating. And so what came out of our interviews was that it was really important to pay attention, not just to verbal speech, but to other ways that individuals were communicating. So sounds, signs, gestures, eye contact, eye gaze, assistive technology and devices, right? And so we wanted to make sure we were writing the survey in ways that were really inclusive of all of these different ways that individuals communicate. This table, I know there's a lot of text here. It shows you the current content that is on that first version of the ORCA measure. And so we wanted to pay attention to including things about expressive communication. So how that individual is, communicating their own messages, receptive communication about how they're understanding messages from their parent or other partner, and then pragmatic or social communication. So we knew those were three major kind of buckets for communication behavior. So the way that we ended up drafting the survey is we drafted behavioral items related to observable behaviors that caregivers could see and report on. And so I'm going to use refusal as an example, because I think this was a nice concept to start with, because almost all children in that first sample could refuse something, whether it was an object or a person or an action like getting in the car. And most examples that we heard revolved around food or specific toys. And so what we did is we pulled out all of the examples that parents gave us about how their child told them they were refusing something or saying no. And there was a sort of a natural hierarchy that started to come out in all these examples. And working with speech and language pathologists and other communication professionals, we started to bucket these examples into these levels. And then we use those levels to draft the items that we were going to ask parents about. So at the end of this formative work, we had a version of the measure that assessed a broad range of communication concepts. It was based primarily and almost entirely off of what we were hearing from parents about important aspects of communication with their children. And it was designed for them to complete independently. So we didn't need an interviewer or an administrator, and took about 15-20 minutes for the caregiver to complete. And so we, at this stage, we started getting, again, a lot of interest from the community, from industry, from regulators, from other patient advocacy organizations. Communication is really important for family functioning, for quality of life. And so what we did was we found a funding opportunity from the US Food and Drug Administration. And we were really lucky to partner with Combined Brain, a patient advocacy organization that entire mission is about, sharing resources and creating efficiencies to get these communities ready for clinical trials. And so we submitted a grant proposal and we were successful. And so I'm going to talk about that right now. So update on the current project and our partnership with the SGS Foundation and how we're hoping to serve your community. So like I said before, this is a funding opportunity from the FDA. So it's through their CEDAR pilot grant program. And this is really attractive to us because it's all about supporting clinical outcome assessment development for clinical trials. So the whole way this funding opportunity is set up is really to support that sort of unique development process where we're gathering information, we're making changes to improve the measure, we're gathering more information, and so on and so forth. And again, we partnered with Combined Brain to help us get access to communities like yours where communication is an important outcome for clinical trials. And so our overall goal is to promote patient-centered clinical trials for different neurodevelopmental disorders by focusing on the measurement of communication ability. So there's a lot of text on this slide too again, but basically this award is a phased award. We're in the first 2 years of this project. And basically this first stage is really information gathering. And so we're focusing on aim 1. So we're identifying core concepts and levels of communication ability across 12 different neurodevelopmental disorders, including Schinzel-Giedion syndrome. And so what we're really focusing on here is more qualitative interviews with caregivers. So we're sitting down with parents and we are really asking them about communication with their child and what's important to really understand what does communication look like? What are the important components of communication? What are the ways in which their child communicates with them? So that's sort of the first component of the interview when we're sitting with caregivers. The second component is we have the survey tool that we developed for Angelman syndrome. We're sharing that with the parent that we're talking to, and we're working through it with them. So, you know, how does this fit your child's experience? How could we improve this to better reflect your child's communication ability? And again, the goal here is to look at the content on the current ORCA measure and to see where we need to improve and what are the other questions that we need to really build this argument that this measure or another measure should be used within a clinical trial where the focus is communication ability. So you might have heard me use this term content validity, and this is one of those terms that comes from the measurement development field. And basically, at its core, it means, are we measuring what we want to measure or we say we're measuring? And are we measuring the important components of whatever that thing is that we're measuring, right? And so in this case, communication ability, are we measuring the important components? And are we measuring the things that really matter to parents and that they pick up on and they observe, and within a clinical trial, we're sensitive enough to detect treatment benefit when it's there? And so really to establish content validity, we have to do that qualitative work, those interviews with parents, right? To really hear from you all what is important and how you communicate with your child. So the end goal, this is a 5-year project, is really to have family-centered measures of communication ability with documented support, right? So we need to make sure that we are supporting our claims that we are measuring communication ability in a valid way. That's going to be compelling to the pharmaceutical companies, to the regulators, to you all as parents, and to other stakeholders like clinicians, so that, you know, we're all on the same page that we're measuring an important thing and we're measuring it in the right way. So at the end of this, we're hoping that any measures that come out are high quality, accessible, meaningful to stakeholders. And I think one of the other things that we're really paying close attention to is, you know, when is the ORCA the best choice? But also, when are some of these other existing measures also a good choice or a better choice than the ORCA, right? Where are sort of the edges in communication ability as we're defining it here? So I want to recognize that I'm one small part of this really large, wonderful group that I work with. And so you'll see these smiling faces here. These are all members of the Duke team that are working on the ORCA initiative. And we have, you know, all sorts of expertise and really thoughtful folks focusing on qualitative work, communication development and theory, statistical analysis, and so forth. The final slide that I have is back to this one, and I'm not going to spend time kind of going through all of these different details, but I think one of the things that I wanted to really highlight is that, you know, the FDA project is part of a larger initiative where we're really focusing on the measurement of communication from the parent and the caregiver perspective. And so we have a number of partners, both within the patient advocacy space, but also in industry and in academia, that's really helping us get information to answer this question, right? How do we measure communication? What does communication look like in these neurodevelopmental disorders, so that, parent voices can really be center to research and clinical trials. The other thing that I wanted to highlight on this slide is up that purple box in the upper right-hand side, specifically for rare diseases, having an international focus and making sure we're not, writing ourselves into a corner by just focusing on, English-speaking US-based participants. We're also, focusing on translation and intercultural validation. And right now, I believe we have, a number of different languages that the original ORCA version is available in. So that's something we're already thinking about for our FDA project too, is how do we make sure that this measure is accessible, that it's useful, and that we're able to measure core components of communication, no matter what language or country somebody is from. All right. So I'll wrap up with my slides, with my time, and just say that, I'm very humbled and honored to be here and to work with you all and your communities, and very grateful always that that you are open to sharing your stories and your children with us. And we are here to serve you. Our group, our work is really focused on serving you and getting your voices into clinical care and research and understanding what matters to you as families. And so that's sort of like the one piece of the larger research process that our group really focuses on. And so thank you all for having us and letting us do this work for you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christy. That was a really great presentation, really clear. And it's really encouraging also to see the translations happening, because I think, for us in particular, we have such an international community and we want everybody to feel included and that they can be part of this. And we have some questions, which I think we have time for a few questions. So one of the questions is, how could the ORCA measure be used to help children with Schinzel-Giedion syndrome access suitable education provision?
That's a really great question. And so, when we started developing the measure, we were specifically focused on the clinical trial setting. And so for clinical trials, it's a little bit different than clinical or education settings, right? Because we're more worried about precision. So we might want to give a longer test in that setting, so that we can really tease out that treatment benefit outside of, noise and normal development, that signal of treatment benefit. One of the things that has come up over the past couple years with this measure is that there seems to be value for educators, for parents to understand their child and how they're communicating, and also clinicians who would like to keep track of a child's progress over time. And so right now, we don't have sort of a report. Sometimes in these neuropsych evaluations, you get a report at the end with a score and there's interpretation of what that means. I think in that setting right now, we don't really know what that would mean for an educational or psychological evaluation, but we are actively working with some clinician partners to get that information out there, because it does feel like it's a need from the community and from other clinicians, and we want to be able to provide something that's useful and actionable. So I would say right now, I don't have a good answer, but it's something that's on our radar and we're actively exploring.
Thank you. And I should say, anyone in the audience who has a question, please pop it in the chat, and we can definitely ask that. I have another question here, which is, who will have access to the results of the ORCA, and can it be shared, I suppose, along a similar line with medical practitioners or therapists?
Yeah, so one of our values is at the Center for Health Measurement is sharing and transparency and providing, access to any measure. So we're actively working with, Combined Brain and SGS, the SGS Foundation, and others who are part of this study to figure out how to disseminate results in a way that's actionable and useful for the community. So one of the ways that we do that in academia, right, is we have these manuscripts and they go through the formal publication process. But I think there's other ways that we're exploring to really disseminate that information back to you all, and also any data, right? Because, you know, as parents, as the foundation, you all should really own your data. And so there's likely additional value that we can build through that qualitative work. And so I think as we collect it, that's sort of an ongoing process as well. So, and the final thing I will note before I forget is that that's also one of the sort of contingencies in the FDA funding, is that our results are public, that we're sharing them, that we're transparent with all of that. So even though we're actively in data collection mode, we're already thinking ahead about how do we give these results back to you all in a way that's most helpful.
Okay, perfect.
Again, more of an in progress question, I think.
And very quickly, because I don't want to sort of delay Chris's talk, but will there be follow-up on the ORCA measure to review how children with SGS and their communication changes as they get older?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So yes, first, the answer is yes. The second answer is what we're doing right now in the qualitative interviews is that we ask parents about how they remember their child's communication changing over time. So in the qualitative work, even though we're talking to parents at one time point, we're getting some of that information. I think the second phase of the study, you know, that will be coming up and starting next year, we will need to kind of know how communication does naturally change over time, because that way, if there's a clinical trial, we can kind of compare the traditional trajectory to improvements or stabilization over time with a medication, right? So yes, that understanding of how communication changes, develops over time is incredibly important question, and that's on our radar as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for answering all of those questions so thoroughly. Well, thank you again, Christy. Really appreciate your time and for being here, and for all the help and support that you're giving the foundation and our children. I mean, as you could tell from the stories earlier, communication is a huge factor for our families. We want our children's voices to be heard, and we're extremely grateful for this collaboration and this opportunity to work with you and your team. So thank you.
Thank you. We're very appreciative as well.
Thank you. So the next session in the SGS Virtual Family Conference is a really important topic for our children. The speaker is Chris Russell, who's a teacher of the visually impaired and based at the New York Deafblind Collaborative, and he will be speaking about cortical visual impairment, or CVI. So make sure you don't miss this talk. It's going to be really, really interesting and extremely relevant for children with SGS and their families. Thank you.